Overnight, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken warned Beijing the actions would lead to serious consequences.
We've been watching this very, very closely, and for the most part, China has been engaged in providing rhetorical, political, diplomatic support to Russia, but we have information that gives us concern that they are considering providing lethal support to Russia in the war against Ukraine. And it was important for me to share very clearly with Wang Yi that this would be a serious problem.
Antony Blinken speaking to CBS from the Munich Security Conference. America's claim comes after China's top diplomat Wang Yi revealed that his country would unveil a plan to bring peace to the warring nations later this week. Rana Mitter heads Oxford University's China Centre and he joins me now. Welcome to Breakfast.
Morning, Patricia. Good to be with you.
Let's look at China's supposed peace plan first. Beijing will unveil its proposal on Friday. But what's your initial reaction to what we've heard? Is China positioning itself as a kind of peacemaker or mediator in Europe?
Well, I think there is a particular thing that the Chinese want to get out of this, Patricia. As you say, the details haven't yet been revealed. We'll wait till Friday to find out what those are going to be. But it's notable that Wang Yi, who's the Foreign Affairs Counselor, so that's not quite the Foreign Minister, that's someone else, Qin Gang, but he's the man being sent out to put China's case on the world stage, has said to what he calls his friends in Europe, that's his phrase, that there should be a new framework which China will have some hand in enabling Europe to get strategic autonomy. In other words, I think the plan is probably more about trying to separate Europe from the United States than it is necessarily about the specifics of what's happening in the war between Russia and Ukraine. It's notable that Wang Yi's statement hasn't said anything very specific about issues such as the violated sovereignty of Ukraine. And that's one of the things that gives you a bit of pause for thought.
Yes, because Beijing has stopped short of condemning Russia's aggression in Ukraine. Can its peace plan or whatever it's trying to do here be taken seriously if it can't take a stronger stand against Moscow?
Well, at the United Nations, to be fair, China has abstained. It hasn't supported Russia. It hasn't voted against it. But overall, as Antony Blinken has pointed out, there have been other elements of rhetorical support for the Russian position. I think the major issue that China will have to deal with is that Ukraine's national sovereignty has been violated. And for China, this is normally an absolute red line. The one principle that almost always China has stuck to in international society is that you're not allowed to break any national boundary that the United Nations has designated as being internationally recognized. And in this particular case, they haven't really proposed a way in which Russia can be interpreted as in some ways being excused for having committed that particular act back in February of last year. But the one thing the Chinese do have is, of course, the ability to phone Moscow up directly and have conversations with them. And so it is just about plausible that they may be amongst the few major powers in the world who could actually talk to Vladimir Putin and try and get him to change his mind, even though he wouldn't publicly admit that that's what he's doing.
This all comes as the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken warns that China is considering providing lethal aid to Russia. How credible is the information the United States is relying on?
I think that we know that the United States has pretty good intelligence surveillance of what's happening in Moscow. That was certainly true up to the outbreak of the war last year. With China, I think they're open in saying that they have less information than they do with Russia. But in this case, the implication seems to be not that lethal support means necessarily literally weapons. It means areas where the Chinese have a particular technological area of advantage, which would include surveillance, for instance. It's well known that artificial intelligence and areas where China's massive advances in computing capacity have enabled it to have very, very advanced capacity to support other types of military attack. That's the kind of area, I suspect, where the United States is giving a warning to China that it should not seek to supply the Russian side.
Why would China consider sending Russia any of this equipment?
It will be very, very wary. There's a bit of a tightrope going on here because China does not want to get caught up in the US and Western sanctions against Russia, which it would do if it were openly supporting them. But it's also very keen to make sure that, in a sense, Washington, D.C. is not seen to be the winner from this particular conflict. The one thing you have to understand, I think, about the way in which Beijing regards this conflict is that it's different from the way that Europeans do. In Europe, Ukraine is seen as an existential fight against an invasion by the dictator Vladimir Putin. For Beijing, it's much more of a contest between the great power blocks of the world. Where are Moscow and Beijing, in other words, going to be able to push back against Washington, D.C.? And that's one of the reasons why, even tacitly, they will continue to give assistance, at least rhetorical and perhaps financial in some ways, to Russia, because they don't want to see a collapsed Russian state that might essentially either be an anarchic situation across their own border or something that the United States can essentially become highly influential in, just as the way it was back in the 1990s, something that China didn't like either.
Antony Blinken is talking tough, warning of serious consequences if China does provide ammunition, weapons, whatever it might be, to Russia. Those consequences, are they what you just referred to? Are they sanctions? Is that the obvious route that the US would take?
I think sanctions, Patricia, are quite likely, but I suspect that what it also means is a ramping up of what we've already seen. If you think about one example, the so-called CHIPS Act, that was passed by the US Congress just a few months ago, and it basically stops lots of very high-quality semiconductor chip technology being exported from American or American-linked companies to China. Now, that's already happened, and it's already in some ways providing an obstacle to China's capacity to develop really high-level technology. So I think it's a bit of a warning that the United States could push even harder in areas that China really cares about, like high-tech, if it seemed to be violating these red lines that Washington's setting down now. That's rather why Blinken's doing it now rather than retrospectively. He wants to make it clear that if anything happens, then he said to Beijing that that was what would in fact happen.
Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Pleasure to be with you.
Rana Mitter is the head of Oxford University's China Centre. And after 8, we'll take a look, a more in-depth look at the Ukraine war ahead of this week's anniversary of the Russian invasion with the former State Secretary of Ukraine and US retired Brigadier General who was a diplomat based in Russia during the invasion of Crimea. A bit of a deeper look at.
Neither is happy with the other when it comes to surveillance balloons, but the main focus was on the war in Ukraine.
So just for a bit of background, China's a close ally of Russia's, and since Russia's war on Ukraine started, Chinese President Xi Jinping and his officials haven't publicly rebuked Russian President Vladimir Putin or Russia more broadly. The West has pressured China to denounce the war and to talk to Russia about a retreat, but that hasn't happened, and China has continued to walk a pretty fine line down the middle. But at that summit in Munich, Wang said that Xi will deliver a peace speech and a document on warring countries' territorial integrity sometime this week.
Despite that, the US isn't convinced that China is about to break with Russia. In fact, it's concerned that China could move to provide Russia with weapons and other support. And Claire, this is all in focus this week because Friday is the first anniversary of Russia's invasion.
Yeah, incredible how that time has gone, and American and European leaders are talking up their support for Ukraine as it continues to fight that war. But there isn't universal support for that strategy, with more weapons and ammunition being sent. At that Munich conference, many leaders from Africa and Asia and South America said that they're suffering under high prices that have been brought about by these war-disrupted supply chains, and they want peace as soon as possible, so they're not really that keen on more weapons going there.
Those leaders aren't the only ones who want peace. At the end of this week, the United Nations General Assembly will vote on a draft resolution demanding Russia make a lasting peace in Ukraine. The resolution doesn't carry any legal weight, but Ukraine and its supporters say it helps keep the pressure on Russia. Estimates say that since the war began, 40 to 60,000 Russian soldiers have died, along with 14,000 Ukrainian troops and civilians. Sticking with the issues that were discussed at the Munich Security Conference, Western leaders were none too pleased with North Korea's latest missile launch, Claire. This one flew about 900 kilometres east for 67 minutes before it landed in the Sea of Japan.
Yeah, and it's not just any missile. It was an intercontinental ballistic missile that was tested on Saturday. It's North Korea's third test of the long-range weapon in less than a year. And that's notable because these missiles can be armed with nuclear warheads and can fly for up to 14,000 kilometres, which means that from North Korea it could strike the US mainland. Analysts say settle in. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is using these tests to rail against joint exercises that are planned in the region by the US and South Korea. That's going to happen next month.
The foreign ministers from Japan and South Korea also met to discuss the latest development at the security conference. And Western leaders condemned North Korea's actions. They said they threaten regional and international peace and security. Claire, we talked a lot last week about ex-tropical cyclone Gabrielle and its hit on New Zealand. The weather system has passed now and a start has been made on counting the cost. Over the weekend, the death toll rose to 11 and more than 5,600 people remain uncontactable across the country.
Most of those will be uncontactable because communication lines are still down in many areas, but authorities say that they do have grave concerns for about 10 people. Recovery teams are now working around the clock to carry out building assessments. There's thousands of damaged homes, lots of roads and bridges and other infrastructure that's out of action. Helicopters are also now delivering critical supplies to stranded communities. So while there's a long way to go to get their arms around the devastation, Prime Minister Chris Hipkins has said that Gabrielle is New Zealand's biggest natural disaster this century.
And across the world, today will be 2 weeks since the devastating earthquakes that hit large parts of Turkey and Syria. The death toll across those two nations has risen to more than 46,000. Victorian Premier Dan Andrews is marking a milestone today, Claire. He's been in office for 3,000 days, and for those who don't want to do the maths, just like me, that equates to more than 8.2 years. And he becomes the 5th Victorian leader to mark that milestone.
Yeah, he says it's just another day at the office, but of all of our political leaders around the country, he's the longest serving one currently in office. There's another reason why it's a talking point, and that's because of a benchmark that was laid down by former Liberal Premier Jeff Kennett. He set 3,000 days as the threshold to memorialise the state's leaders, and as a result, they made statues for long-serving premiers Albert Dunstan, Henry Bolte, Rupert Harmer, and also John Cain. Kennett himself fell just short of that, but by that standard that was set, Andrews is now eligible for a bronze statue outside the Premier's office in Melbourne.
But Andrews is going to have to wait on that. The Department of Premier and Cabinet says that statues of long-serving premiers in Victoria are considered after the leader has left office, so a bronze version of Andrews in his pandemic North Face jacket is probably a while off yet. It's been a weekend of ups and downs for cricket tragics, Claire. Let's start with the upside. That's our T20 women's team absolutely dominating at the World Cup in South Africa.
They are just so good. The Aussie women defeated host nation South Africa yesterday morning to sail through to the World Cup semi-finals. And yes, we're the top-ranked team. We're also the tournament favourites, but it still feels really good to see them playing so well. And in a good sign, we won yesterday morning's match without opening batter and wicket-keeper Alyssa Healy. She's injured with a quad injury, but she's expected to return on Saturday for the semis. That's where the joy ends for cricket fans. Our men's test team was whacked by India in the second test in the series in India. Australia went down to the hosts late yesterday by 6 wickets. There was a batting collapse where we lost 9 wickets for 52 runs.
Yeah, cricket statistic nerds say it's Australia's 3rd worst 9-wicket collapse in history. I'm not entirely sure what that means, but it sounds bad. As a result, India retained the Border Gavaskar Trophy, and it leaves the Aussies searching for answers about their batting, which has let them down in India. There are 3 matches in the series to go. More details of King Charles' May 6 coronation have been released, Claire. At the new King's request, musical theatre giant Andrew Lloyd Webber will contribute an anthem to reflect the joyful occasion.
And look, Alice, long-time squizzers will know that I'm absolutely no fan of musical theatre, and particularly Andrew Lloyd Webber. So let's just say if you really hated me, you would make me go to Cats or Phantom of the Opera. It's a good way of torturing me, but apparently for King Charles, it's the way to go.
Claire, I'm just laughing at how you've extended that theme in today's newsletter, talking about the unconfirmed final guest list, saying the Sussexes might have had a lucky escape.
Yeah, and look, if Harry and Meghan are invited and